The wind moves first, dry, whispering, restless, dragging dust across a sun-bleached plain where nothing stands still for long. This was the Wild West, a land stitched together by hardship, hunger, and the hope that tomorrow might be gentler than today. But out here, the open range offers no mercy. The cold bites, the heat clings, and the silence, it listens. Could you have carried water 6 miles just to boil beans? Or trusted a stranger when the sheriff rode out and never came back? Tell me below, where are you listening from tonight? Is it morning, evening, or time to drift into sleep? Now dim your screen. Let the air grow still. Let the desert hush surround you. The sun leaned heavy on the horizon, low and amber, its last light spilling across the flat, endless expanse of earth. The stagecoach wheels had ground to a halt hours earlier, leaving only silence in their wake, and in that silence, I felt the first true measure of the Wild West. Dust came before me, carried on the restless wind, slipping under the brim of my hat and stinging at my eyes as if the land itself wanted me to turn back. I stepped down onto hard-packed soil, boots sinking slightly into grooves carved by countless wagons before mine. The sound was sharp, heel then toe, and it startled even me in the wide emptiness. Before me stretched the faint outline of a settlement. No grand city, no promised land of prosperity, but a scatter of wooden buildings hunched against the wind like weary travellers themselves. The air smelled of raw timber and animal sweat, sharp with a faint tang of smoke from a nearby fire. Someone, somewhere, was cooking supper, but the aroma was thin, a whisper of beans and ash more than a meal. Hunger rose in my belly, not sharp but steady, like a reminder of how far I was from home and how uncertain this place was about welcoming me. Children's laughter echoed faintly from behind one of the structures, yet even their joy was tempered, brief, quickly hushed by a woman's call. It wasn't the carefree laughter of playgrounds or gardens back east. It was clipped, weary, as if joy itself knew better than to linger too long in a place like this. The main street was no more than a stretch of dirt, lined with buildings that leaned on their own shadows. A saloon, its swinging doors battered by both fists and wind. A general store with a hand-painted sign, the letters already fading. A blacksmith's shed, the dull clink of hammer on iron rising steady, patient, almost like a heartbeat to the town. I paused, drawing in the breath of the place. The silence wasn't true silence. It was filled with subtler sounds, the creak of wood settling, the distant cry of a hawk, the restless shifting of horses tied outside the saloon. Their hooves struck the ground softly, a rhythm that spoke of waiting. Everything here waited for rain, waited for trouble, waited for some promise that tomorrow might be easier than today. I thought of home, of green fields, of the smell of bread warm from the oven, of streets that bustled with noise and certainty. Out here, certainty was a stranger. Out here, you woke each day not knowing if the earth would feed you or starve you, if the neighbour who greeted you at dawn would still be alive come dusk. A man passed by, his boots kicking up dust in slow, measured steps. His hat was pulled low, face shadowed, but I could feel the weight of his glance. Suspicion lay heavy in it, though not unkind, just the reflex of someone who had seen enough to know strangers rarely brought ease. He tipped his hat, a motion so small it might have been imagined, and kept on walking. I realized then that in this place, words were measured like gold, spent rarely and with care. The saloon door creaked open, spilling lamplight into the fading day. Inside, I glimpsed men hunched over cards, their shoulders bent as if guarding what little fortune they had. The piano sat silent in the corner, its keys long untouched, a layer of dust on ivory that once knew songs of home and laughter. Now the only music was the shuffle of cards and the soft slide of glass across a bar polished thin by countless hands. I pushed the door open and the room turned. Not harsh, not aggressive, simply aware. In the east, a stranger might arrive unnoticed, one of many. Here, one pair of boots crossing the threshold was enough to shift the entire rhythm of the room. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and sweat, layered over the faint sweetness of spilled whiskey. Floorboards creaked beneath me as I walked, every sound amplified. The barkeep, a man with arms like tree trunks and a face carved with lines deeper than any canyon, nodded toward me. "You'll want water first," he said, voice low, steady. It was less a question than a command, and I obeyed. The glass was set down heavy before me, and the water inside was cloudy, carrying the taste of iron and dust. Yet it slid cool against my throat, relief immediate. In that moment, I understood why he had offered it before whiskey. Out here, liquor was a luxury, but water was salvation. A voice at my side spoke, softer, curious. "New to town?" I turned. The man who had spoken wore a vest patched at the shoulders, his beard uneven, his eyes tired yet sharp. He didn't smile, but there was no malice in his tone. Just a kind of knowing. "Stagecoach," I answered, my words clumsy in the stillness. He nodded, as though that single word told him everything. Where I had come from, why I had risked the journey, what I hoped to find here. Perhaps it did. The evening stretched on, shadows deepening. Lamps flickered, casting amber light that swayed with every draught. The men returned to their cards, though their laughter was restrained, their bets measured not in excess, but in necessity. Every coin clinked like it carried the weight of survival itself. I left the saloon when the night had settled, when stars emerged sharp and endless above me. They were not the gentle stars of a countryside sky, framed by trees and softened by distance. These were hard, cold lights, scattered across a darkness so vast it felt as though I might fall into it if I stared too long. The night air was cool, carrying with it the faint howl of a coyote somewhere beyond the edge of the settlement. Horses shifted, their tack rattling faintly, restless even in sleep. I found a bed in a boarding house, no more than a narrow cot, its mattress thin and lumpy, its sheets smelling of lye and smoke. Yet when I lay upon it, exhaustion overtook me quickly. Through the window, I could hear the whisper of the wind, endless, never satisfied. It slipped through cracks in the walls, carrying with it grains of dust that settled into the corners, into the folds of my clothing, into the very air I breathed. Out here, dust was not something you brushed away. It became part of you. Sleep came slow, heavy. My last thought before it claimed me was of how small I felt in this land, how uncertain my place within it. Yet beneath that thought was another quieter still. The faint, unshakable curiosity of what tomorrow might reveal. The night stretched into silence, yet it was never a silence empty of life. Somewhere a door creaked shut. Somewhere else, a child coughed. The town breathed, restless even in its slumber. And I lay awake, listening to the heartbeat of the Wild West. Steady, unyielding, and utterly indifferent to whether I endured it. And as I drifted finally into sleep, the wind shifted again, carrying with it the sound of distant hoofbeats. The hoofbeats echoed faintly, fading into the distance until they were no more than a memory pressed into the silence of night. I lay still upon the narrow cot, the thin quilt pulled against my chest, ears straining for any sign that they might return. But the sound was gone, carried away with the dust, leaving me alone with the creak of the boarding house walls and the soft breathing of others who shared this place of uneasy rest. Sleep did not come easily here. The boards beneath the mattress shifted with every movement, their rough grain pressing against my back. The pillow was little more than a sack of straw, its scent earthy, stubborn, a reminder that comforts of the East had been left far behind. Yet it was not discomfort alone that kept me wakeful. It was the feeling that outside, beyond these thin walls, the land itself watched and waited. At last, I rose. The floor was cool beneath bare feet, dust clinging even in the dark. I crossed the small room quietly, careful not to wake the figure on the neighbouring cot. He stirred once, muttered something I could not catch, then settled again, his breathing deep and steady. The door creaked softly as I eased it open, and the night air rushed in, crisp and sharp, tinged with the faint smoke of dying fires. Stepping outside, I was struck at once by the vastness above me. The stars stretched without end, sharp as cut glass. So close they seemed to tremble with breath. They hung over the town like sentinels, cold and eternal, and for a moment I felt smaller than I had ever known myself to be. Back east, the sky was softer, dimmed by lamplight, muted by the press of trees and hills. Here, there was nothing to soften it. No walls, no ceilings, no curtain of clouds to shield the eye. Just an ocean of black and silver, endless, unbroken, demanding awe. The boards of the porch were rough beneath me as I sank onto them, arms resting upon my knees. From here, the town looked even smaller than it had in daylight. The saloon was dark now, its doors shut tight, its laughter silenced. The blacksmith's forge stood cold, the hammer still. A lantern glowed faintly from the window of the general store, though whether it was kept for security or simply forgotten, I could not tell. And then there was the chapel, perched at the far end of the street, its steeple leaning slightly, as though bowing to the endless sky. No bell tolled, but I imagined the sound it might make. Lonely, hollow, swallowed by the wind long before it reached any ear beyond this little settlement. The silence pressed closer, and with it, thoughts of home returned again. The way the night had smelled of lilac and warm stone after a summer's rain. The hum of crickets beneath windows left open for coolness. The low murmur of neighbours calling good night across fences. Out here, the air smelled of dust and horses, and the only sound was the whisper of the wind through endless grass. But then, from somewhere near the outskirts, came another sound. A lull of hoofbeats, slower this time, steady, as if someone rode the edge of town, not with haste, but with patience. I stiffened, listening, yet no alarm was raised. Perhaps it was nothing more than a ranch hand returning late, or a traveller passing through. Still, I could not shake the sense that each sound carried meaning here, that nothing happened without being noted by the land itself. My eyes drifted again to the stars. I had read once that travellers guided themselves by them, crossing deserts and mountains by their patterns alone. Tonight, they seemed to me less like guides and more like judges, bearing silent witness to every choice made beneath their gaze. After a time, the door behind me opened. A figure stepped out, the boards groaning beneath his weight. It was the man from the saloon, the one who had asked if I was new. He carried a pipe between his fingers, though it was unlit. He lowered himself onto the porch beside me without a word, his presence quiet but solid. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The night did not need our voices. It was already filled with the hum of crickets and the distant yip of a coyote. At last, he tapped the empty pipe against his palm and said, "Sky keeps a man honest out here. No hiding from it." I nodded, unsure whether an answer was expected. He gestured toward the horizon, where the faint glow of moonlight traced the outline of hills. "That's where they run cattle. Days are long, nights longer. You'll find sleep comes different here. Harder sometimes. Easier others." His words carried no urgency, no attempt to lecture or impress. They were simple truths, spoken with the weight of someone who had learned them not from books, but from living them day after day. I asked quietly, "How long have you been here?" "Long enough," he replied, with a faint smile I caught only in the corner of his mouth. "Long enough to know this place don't give what you don't earn. But it'll take, whether you're ready or not." We sat in silence after that, watching the stars. The air grew colder, the boards beneath us soaking the chill until it rose through my bones. Yet I did not return inside. There was something in the stillness that compelled me to remain, as though I might learn something from the night if only I stayed long enough to hear it. When at last the man stood to leave, he tipped his hat in quiet farewell and stepped back through the door. I remained alone, the stars keeping their vigil. Sleep did not come until much later, when at last I returned to my narrow bed. I lay upon it, with the memory of stars still bright behind my eyes, the creak of boards still beneath me, the sound of hoofbeats echoing faint but insistent in my ears. And when sleep found me, it was not restful. I dreamed of open skies and endless dust, of water too far to reach, of voices carried by the wind that I could not quite understand. The Wild West had its way of speaking, though not in words. It spoke through silence, through hunger, through the vastness of sky and the hardness of earth. And as dawn's first light began to touch the horizon, I understood that it would take more than endurance to last here. It would take surrender. The dawn came not with a chorus of birdsong, but with the low groan of wind stirring across the plains and the clatter of hoofbeats from early riders. The first light of morning slipped through cracks in the boarding house shutters, streaking the room in bands of pale gold. Dust floated in the shafts of light, turning the air thick and grainy, as though even sunlight had to wrestle its way through this land. I rose stiffly from the cot, back sore from the hard boards beneath the thin mattress. The air carried the scent of smoke, strong and sharp, drifting from stoves already kindled in kitchens nearby. It mingled with something richer, the faint aroma of beans simmering, bread baking slowly over coals. Hunger stirred at once. Out here, hunger never lay far from waking. The boarding house offered breakfast of sorts. A small tin plate, a rough slice of bread no thicker than a finger, and a ladle of beans cooked until their skins broke and their flavour clung heavy to the tongue. The bread was coarse, baked from flour stretched with cornmeal, dry enough that it needed soaking to swallow comfortably. Yet I ate it as though it were feast enough. In the West, food was not judged by its delicacy, but by its presence. Around me, the other boarders ate in silence. One man tore his bread in careful halves, saving part for later. Another chewed slowly, eyes distant, as if counting the days since his last true meal. A woman with a child pressed close to her side ate quickly, urging the boy to take his share before she finished her own. There was no conversation, no laughter, only the steady scrape of spoons against tin and the occasional sigh. When the plates were empty, I stepped outside, following the pull of the day toward the main street. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the chill, and the town had begun to stir. Wagons rolled in with creaking wheels, their beds loaded with sacks of flour, barrels of salted pork, bundles of tools. Horses snorted, their breath visible in the cool air, while men shouted greetings that sounded more like warnings. The general store sat at the heart of it all, a low wooden building with a wide porch and shelves stacked high with whatever could be hauled across the plains. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of leather, tobacco, and dried goods. The shelves bore sacks of beans, rolls of cloth, small barrels of sugar, tins of coffee. Beside them hung rifles and boxes of ammunition, displayed not as luxuries but as necessities equal to food and water. I watched as a farmer stepped up to the counter, his hat in his hands. He laid down a small pouch of coins, counted slowly, his thumb pressing each piece as though reluctant to let it go. "Need flour," he said simply. The storekeeper weighed the pouch, opened the sack, poured carefully until the balance seemed right. No scales, no paperwork. Only trust, or something close to it. Behind him, another man leaned a rifle against the counter. "Got no cash," he said, voice low, but the rifle's sound. "Needs oiling, but she'll fire." The storekeeper examined it, thumb brushing the stock, eye narrowing along the barrel. After a pause, he nodded, pushing across a bag of coffee and a small tin of lard. The exchange was wordless, the rifle sliding behind the counter as the man gathered his food. It struck me then how little currency meant here, how survival demanded barter as often as coin. Bread was worth bullets. Bullets were worth beans. A sack of sugar might win you favor, while a box of cartridges might keep you alive. Every item carried weight far beyond its size, its value shifting with the wind, with the weather, with the desperation of those in need. I drifted between the shelves, my fingers brushing against coarse cloth, cool tin, smooth wood. Each object told a story. A spool of thread might mend the only shirt a man owned. A candle might light a cabin for a month, its flame as precious as fire itself. A box of matches could mean the difference between warmth and freezing when the cold came suddenly. Outside, voices rose. A wagon had arrived bearing barrels of water, drawn from a well some miles away. At once, people gathered, each carrying pails, buckets, jars. The driver climbed down, his face weathered, his shoulders bowed beneath the weight of both travel and expectation. He set a price, 1 coin for a bucket, and no one argued. Water was not debated here. It was accepted, rationed, guarded as fiercely as gold. A boy no older than 10 struggled to carry a wooden pail nearly his size, his small hands red from gripping the handle. A woman reached to steady him, her face lined with both kindness and weariness. Together they lifted it into the wagon bed, the sound of sloshing water, a reminder of how precious and fragile their prize truly was. I stepped closer, offering my hand, and the boy looked up, eyes wide, uncertain. After a moment's hesitation, he let me help. and together we carried the bucket to his family's wagon. His mother nodded in quiet thanks, her lips forming a smile that barely reached her eyes. Gratitude here was measured, restrained, as though too much warmth might be mistaken for weakness. The day stretched onward, heat rising, dust clinging to skin and clothing alike. The blacksmith worked steadily, hammer ringing against iron, each strike echoing through the town like a heartbeat. Sparks flew, bright against the dim interior, while the scent of scorched metal filled the air. Men lined up for nails, horseshoes, tools. Simple things, yet each one a lifeline in this place where nothing came easily. Later, I found myself back at the saloon, not for whiskey, but for water and shade. The room was cooler than the street, its dimness a relief from the unrelenting sun. Men leaned over tables, their voices low, their words carrying the weight of more than just cards. They spoke of drought, of herds lost to sickness, of neighbours who had packed wagons and vanished into the horizon. One man laid down a deck, shuffling it with fingers quick and sure. "You can gamble with cards," he said softly, "but the real gamble's whether the land will let you eat." Heads nodded, not in agreement, but in resignation. It was not news, only truth. I thought then of the bread I had eaten that morning, coarse and dry, and how precious it had been, despite its meagre taste. Every meal was a bargain, every bite a trade between hunger and survival. In the East, bread was taken for granted. Here, bread was barter, as valuable as any bullet resting in a rifle's chamber. The day slipped toward evening. Shadows stretched long, and the town quieted. Wagons rolled out, dust trailing behind them like fading memories. The store's shutters were drawn, the barrels of water carried off to cabins and camps beyond the street. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent, and even the horses stilled, their restlessness easing with the cool of dusk. I walked slowly back toward the boarding house, the weight of the day pressing upon me. My hands were empty, yet my mind carried the heaviness of what I had seen. The measured hunger, the careful bargains, the way life here hinged not on luxury, but on the barest essentials. As the first stars pierced the darkening sky, I realized the truth of it. Out here, a man didn't live by what he owned, but by what he could trade, what he could endure, what he could surrender. Bread, bullets, barter. These were the currency of the Wild West, and survival was the only wealth worth having. The wind never truly stopped here. Even in the quietest hours it moved, brushing against boards, rattling loose shutters, stirring dust along the empty road. It was as though the land itself needed to speak, though its voice was hollow and endless, carrying not comfort, but reminders. Reminders that we were small, fragile, temporary in a place older and stronger than any one of us. On the frontier, words themselves became precious. Not just the words traded over card tables or muttered across fences, but the words written by hand, carried across rivers, deserts and mountains, to find their way into a palm calloused by work and weather. A letter was not merely paper and ink. It was a lifeline, a fragile thread binding one world to another. It was late afternoon when the stagecoach arrived again, its wheels grinding against the dry earth, its frame rocking with the weight of passengers and parcels. But more than supplies or new faces, the town gathered for the small leather satchel slung over the driver's shoulder. Inside lay letters, some no larger than a folded sheet, others thick with news. They were treasures more coveted than coin, for they brought not food, not tools, but something rarer, connection. The driver dismounted, dust falling from his coat, and handed the satchel to the storekeeper, who became postmaster by necessity. The townsfolk gathered in a loose semicircle, faces lined with expectation, fear, and hope. The storekeeper's fingers, thick from years of lifting crates, moved carefully as he sorted through the letters. One by one, names were called. A man stepped forward, his hand trembling as he took the envelope, lips parting as if he might speak, though no words came. He tucked the letter into his breast pocket, eyes lowered, as though afraid to read it in front of others, as though its words might break him if spoken aloud in public. A woman received hers with a smile that broke her weariness for the briefest moment. She pressed it against her lips, her eyes wet, whispering something I could not hear before she hurried away, clutching it tightly as though afraid it might vanish. Some names were called, and no one stepped forward. The letters were set aside, placed in a small wooden box behind the counter. They would wait, gathering dust, until their owners returned, or until no one remained to claim them. And then there were the names not called at all. Faces fell quietly, no sound of protest, only the slow return of eyes to the ground, shoulders sagging beneath the weight of absence. For some, silence was the loudest answer. I stood back, watching, my chest heavy with the memory of my own family. I had no letter waiting, none sent, none received. But I remembered the warmth of my mother's hand as she folded notes into envelopes, her script careful, her words chosen with love. I thought of my father's short, steady letters, more reports than reflections, yet filled with the gravity of care. Out here, even the memory of a letter felt like comfort. Later, I found myself at the edge of town, where the wind moved more freely, carrying with it the faint murmur of voices from within cabins and tents. Not conversations exactly, but fragments. A child's laugh, a man's low hum as he worked at mending a harness, the quiet murmur of prayer spoken before supper. These sounds drifted out like smoke, carried on the wind, blending until they became part of the land's chorus. But gossip travelled just as swiftly. Words spoken in low tones at the saloon had a way of reaching ears at the well by morning. A man's debt, a quarrel between neighbours, a rumour of bandits spotted along the trail, all carried by voices that spread not maliciously, but inevitably. In a place this small, nothing remained hidden for long. That night, as I sat again on the boarding house porch, the stars overhead and the dust curling through the street, I heard voices drifting from the saloon, not the rough cheer of gambling or song, but hushed tones, steady, urgent. I could not make out the words, only the cadence, the rise and fall of men deciding something weighty. The wind caught their whispers, pulling them into the night, carrying fragments that teased the ear but never resolved into sense. It struck me then how the wind itself seemed a messenger, stealing words from mouths and delivering them half-formed to strangers. Perhaps this was why people spoke so little here, why words were measured and rationed like water. Once spoken, they belonged not to the speaker, but to the air, to the land, to the ears of whoever might be listening just beyond sight. The next morning, I walked past the chapel, where its crooked steeple stood in quiet defiance against the sky. Inside, I found a man bent over a Bible, his lips moving silently as he traced each line with his finger. He looked up when I entered, his eyes weary but kind. "Word of God," he said softly, is the only word the wind can't steal. I thought on that as I stepped outside again, the sun rising hot already, the air dry against my throat. Perhaps he was right, or perhaps even sacred words were carried off into the dust, scattered, reshaped, lost among the endless miles of silence. That evening, the stagecoach departed again, carrying passengers back eastward, away from this lonely frontier. As the wheels creaked and the horses strained, voices rose in farewell, some soft, some trembling, some steady. Promises to write, promises to return, promises that, like so much in this place, might or might not be kept. The wind caught those farewells, lifting them into the twilight, carrying them down the road until they faded into nothing. And I wondered, as I listened, whether this was how the West itself survived, not by holding on to words, but by letting them go, letting them drift into the air, into memory, into the endless night sky where only the stars bore witness. That night, as I lay upon my cot, I dreamed of voices. Some I knew, some I did not, all carried on the restless wind. They called to me, but their words slipped through my grasp, dissolving before I could hold them. I woke with a taste of dust in my mouth, the sound of whispers still fading in my ears. And I knew then that the Wild West was not defined only by what a man could touch or trade, but by the words he carried, the words he lost, and the silence that pressed between them. The days passed slowly, each marked less by the clock than by the sun's measured climb and fall. In the West, time seemed stretched, drawn thin across long hours of work, yet pressed suddenly into urgency when danger or need appeared without warning. And through it all, silence threaded the hours together, steady as a shadow. At first, the quiet unsettled me. Back east, life hummed with noise, merchants calling in the marketplace, bells toll in the hour, neighbours speaking across fences, horses' hooves clattering on cobblestones. But here, words were scarce. In this town, a day might pass with little more than the creak of a wagon, the groan of boards underfoot, the faint ring of a hammer. When voices came, they came sparingly, as though language itself was a resource to be conserved. I learned quickly that silence did not mean absence. Rather, it was a language all its own. Men tipped their hats instead of greeting. A nod across the street might carry more meaning than a paragraph. A glance, short and sharp, could warn more clearly than a shouted cry. Out here, survival hinged on more than what was said. It depended on what was understood without words. One morning, I watched the blacksmith at his forge. He worked with deliberate rhythm, hammer striking iron in a cadence that seemed almost like speech. A boy, perhaps his apprentice, brought him tools, fetched water, watched with sharp eyes. Yet between them, no words passed. The boy knew what to do, when to move, what was needed. It was a conversation made of gestures, of trust built over long days of shared silence. Later, I sat at the saloon's corner table, nursing a tin cup of water cooled with melted snow hauled down from the mountains. A man entered, tall, shoulders squared, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He said nothing, only moved toward the bar. The barkeep set down a glass before him without asking. No order spoken, no price debated. Each man knew what the other wanted, what the other would give. Their silence was smoother than words, as though speech might have only cluttered the moment. At the well in the centre of town, women gathered with their buckets. Their voices were hushed, but their eyes told more. One woman's glance lingered on the sky, where clouds were few and thin. Another shook her head slightly, as though to say there would be no rain soon. A raised eyebrow, a hand resting a moment too long on a bucket's rim. Each gesture spoke volumes. Children, restless nearby, learned to quiet themselves quickly when such looks passed between their mothers. Even laughter here was quiet. A man might chuckle, brief and low, but it faded fast, swallowed by the air, as though joy itself should not draw too much attention. There was a gravity to living here, a weight that pressed upon even the simplest exchanges. Yet silence was not only practical, it was also protective. Words, once spoken, carried on the wind, caught by ears that might twist them, hold them, use them. Silence shielded a man's thoughts, kept his fears and his plans close to the chest. It was armor as surely as leather or steel. One evening I found myself on the porch again. The stars spread wide above, the boards cool beneath me. A man joined me, one I had seen often, though we had never spoken. He carried with him a pipe, unlit, and sat beside me without ceremony. For a long while, we watched the horizon together, where the last threads of sunset lingered like smoke. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. His presence was steady, solid, and in it, I felt a quiet comfort. Words might have broken it. At length, he sighed, a sound low and weary, and rose to leave. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture as eloquent as any farewell. I returned it with a nod, and he stepped into the night. We had shared an hour, yet not a sentence. And somehow I felt we understood each other better than if we had filled the time with speech. As days turned into weeks, I began to adopt this rhythm myself. My tongue grew slower, my ears sharper. I found meaning in pauses, in the way a hand lingered on a doorframe, in the way a rider slowed his horse before reaching town, waiting, watching. The air itself seemed filled with unsaid words, a current stronger than speech. And there was something freeing in it. To live without filling the silence, to let the wind carry only dust and not excess words, was to move in harmony with the land. It taught patience, attentiveness, humility. It forced one to listen, not only to people, but to the world itself. One afternoon, I walked beyond the edge of town, where the prairie, or rather the open range, stretched wide and endless. The grass bent beneath the wind, swaying in a language older than mankind. No voices here, only the whisper of earth itself. I sat upon a rock and listened, and in that silence, I felt less alone. The land spoke in its own way, steady and enduring, and if one was quiet enough, perhaps it could be understood. That night, as I returned to the boarding house, I passed two men outside the saloon. They stood close, their words hushed, too low for me to hear, but their bodies told the tale. The way one leaned forward, tense, fists curled. The way the other stepped back, hand brushing the butt of his revolver. I quickened my pace, slipping past them, but even without hearing their words, I knew the truth. Their silence was far louder than any shout. Conflict here often began not with words, but with their absence. Back in my narrow bed, I lay listening to the creaks of the building, to the shifting of the wind through cracks in the walls. Silence filled the space, yet it was not empty. It was thick with meaning, with presence. It was the sound of the West itself. And as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I realized that if I was to endure here, I would have to learn not just the language of men, but the language of silence, the pauses, the glances, the unspoken truths carried on the wind. For in this land, silence was not void. It was voice. It began as a tremor, faint and uncertain, like the stirring of a dream too heavy to wake from. I sat on the porch in the fading light, the day's work settling into the bones of the town, when the sound reached me. Low, rhythmic, distant. At first, I thought it was thunder, a storm rolling in across the plains, but the sky was clear, streaked only with long, pale ribbons of cloud. No rain waited there. The sound grew steadier, sharper. Hooves. I rose slowly, leaning on the post as I listened. The wind carried it closer, a growing rush, many horses running together, their weight shaking the ground, their rhythm pressing into the chest like a second heartbeat. The town seemed to feel it all at once. A door creaked open across the street. Curtains shifted. A child's voice asked something, quickly hushed by a mother's hand. The air changed. A stillness fell heavy, though the hoofbeats grew louder. Men stepped into the street, slow and watchful, their hands hanging close to their belts, their eyes narrowing against the horizon. No words were spoken, but silence itself tightened, bracing. The Wild West had its own way of warning, and it rarely came in shouts. It came in the absence of sound, in the shared breath of people who knew danger when they heard it. And then they appeared. Riders burst over the rise in a cloud of dust, their shapes blurred at first, then sharp against the dimming sky. Their horses pounded the earth, manes flying, nostrils flared. The men upon them were rough, shoulders broad beneath weather-worn coats, hats pulled low, scarves pulled high against the dust. They rode not with the easy rhythm of ranch hands, but with the force of men who entered a place to take, not to ask. The town did not scream. It did not scatter. Instead, it braced, quiet and taut, as though each soul within it had rehearsed this moment too many times already. A man at the well slipped his hand behind a barrel. The barkeep, framed in the saloon doorway, shifted slightly, his weight balanced. Mothers gathered children to their skirts, eyes cast downward but sharp with fear. The riders slowed as they entered, hooves throwing up clouds that hung heavy in the air. Their leader, if such men could be said to have one, was tall, his coat dark, his horse restless beneath him. He surveyed the town with eyes like shadow, unhurried, unkind. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence spoke enough. We take, and you endure. They dismounted with the confidence of men who expected no challenge. Boots struck the earth hard. Spurs jingled. The sound of leather and iron filled the air, sharper than any word. One man stepped into the store, another into the saloon. The leader stood in the street, gloved hand stroking his horse's neck as though he had all the time in the world. Still, no one spoke. The blacksmith leaned in his doorway, arms crossed, hammer tucked out of sight but ready. A boy froze at the edge of the street, eyes wide, until his mother pulled him sharply back. Every movement was calculated, measured, heavy with meaning. In the West, survival often meant knowing when silence served better than sound. Inside the saloon, glasses clinked, a chair scraped. A voice, low, drawn, demanded something. I could not hear the words, but I could feel their shape. Whiskey, perhaps, or money, or both. The barkeep's reply came quiet, steady, like the measured voice of a man who had stood in this place too many times before. From the store, a crash sounded, a box overturned, tins rolling. The storekeeper's face appeared briefly in the window, pale and strained. Then it vanished, swallowed again by the shadows inside. The riders outside shifted, restless. One laughed, short and sharp, the sound harsh in the silence. Another spat into the dirt. Still the leader said nothing, his eyes sweeping the town like a storm that had yet to break. I felt the chill then, deep in the marrow. Not the chill of cold air, but the kind that comes when danger stands close, breathing the same dust, waiting for a reason to strike. At last the leader spoke. His voice was low, even, almost gentle. That was what made it worse. "We'll take what's needed," he said. "No trouble, no fight. You all want it that way." No one answered. The silence stretched, tense and brittle. The town held its breath. One wrong word, one wrong move, and it would snap. But then, as quickly as they had arrived, the moment passed. The men emerged again, one with a sack slung over his shoulder, another swigging from a bottle, another tucking a roll of tobacco into his coat. They mounted their horses with the same easy arrogance, dust rising in swirls as hooves struck earth again. The leader looked once more at the town, his eyes unreadable. Then he tipped his hat, not in courtesy, but in mockery, and spurred his horse forward. The riders turned as one, the thunder of their hooves filling the air once more, rolling down the street, out into the horizon, leaving behind only silence and dust. For a long time, no one moved. The town seemed to exhale all at once, doors opening, shoulders loosening, breath released. The blacksmith stepped back into his forge. The barkeep disappeared into the dim of the saloon. A child began to cry, sharp and sudden, and his mother hushed him quickly, rocking him against her shoulder. I remained on the porch, heart heavy with the weight of what I had seen. There had been no fight, no bloodshed, not this time. But the danger had been real, sharp, undeniable. The West lived always at the edge of such moments, where silence might hold or might shatter into violence without warning. That night, as I lay in my cot, the hoofbeats echoed still in my ears. I dreamed of storms, of horses pounding across endless plains, of men whose faces were shadows, whose silence was more terrible than any shout. I woke with sweat upon my brow, though the air was cool, the night wind steady. The Wild West was not a place of constant violence. It was worse. It was a place where violence might come at any moment, carried on the thunder of hooves, breaking the stillness like glass. A place where dread lived not in the fight itself, but in the waiting, in the silence before and after. And in that silence, I understood. Survival here was not only a matter of endurance, it was a matter of listening to the wind, to the ground, to the hoofbeats that warned of storms not written in the sky. After the thunder of hooves, silence returned to the town, though it was not the same silence as before. It was taut, uneasy, as though the dust itself carried the memory of what had passed. For days afterward, every creak of a board, every shadow stretching across the street felt like the prelude to another arrival. But none came. Life, in its stubborn way, pressed forward. And in the West, pressing forward meant looking to water. Water was not only a need here, it was a law, a measure, a currency. Without it, no seed would sprout, no herd would last, no family could endure. A man might live days without bread, might barter bullets and beans, but without water, he would not see the week's end. The well at the heart of town was shallow and fickle. In spring, when the snowmelt flowed from the far mountains, its buckets rose full and cool. But as summer stretched long, the water sank deeper, thinner, slower to rise. Each pull of the rope brought less, and the line of waiting buckets grew longer. The air itself seemed thirsty, pulling moisture from lips, from skin, from the very soil beneath our boots. I stood one morning in that line, my hands around a dented pail, watching as the bucket descended into shadow. The rope creaked, the pulley groaned, the bucket scraped against stone. When it rose again, its bottom glistened only faintly, less than half filled. The man beside me muttered under his breath, shaking his head, though he said no more. Complaint was wasted energy here. Thirst would not be answered by words. As I waited, I studied the faces around me. Women with sunburnt cheeks, their bonnets pulled low, their hands red and rough. Children shifting restlessly, lips cracked, eyes dull with heat. Men standing silent, their gazes fixed on the well as though sheer will might summon water to the surface. No one jostled, no one pushed. Patience was not virtue, it was necessity. When my turn came, I hauled the bucket slowly, feeling the rope bite into my palms. The water inside was cloudy, warm, carrying the taste of earth. Yet as I poured it into my pail, it seemed precious beyond measure. Each drop shimmered in the morning light like silver coins, slipping away too quickly, never enough. Later that day, I walked beyond the town's edge, where a creek cut shallow through the land. Once it had flowed strong, its banks green, its surface alive with darting fish. Now it trickled weakly, barely more than a thread, its stones exposed, its song diminished to a whisper. I knelt, cupping my hands into the stream, drinking slowly. The water was cool, metallic, carrying the grit of sand, yet it felt like a blessing. A boy appeared not far downstream, filling a jug with care. His eyes flicked toward me, wary, but he said nothing. In this place, even children understood the unspoken truth. Water belonged to all, but trust was rationed like bread. Too much taken, too little shared, and neighbours became enemies faster than words could mend. That evening, as I sat once more on the boarding house porch, the townsfolk gathered at the well. Not for water, it had run nearly dry that day, but for words. Voices rose in careful turns, each one weighted with urgency. Some spoke of digging deeper, though the soil was rock and hardpan. Others spoke of sending wagons to the river miles away, though the trail was dangerous. Bandits known to haunt its bends. A woman, her arms crossed, said softly, "It is not just water we measure, it is trust. Who will fetch and who will drink first? Who decides what is fair?" The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. At last, the storekeeper, his hands calloused from both coin and rope, spoke. "We draw lots, we share what comes. That way, no man's word is above another's." There were nods, though not all of agreement. Still, no one challenged him openly. Out here, fairness was not perfection, but compromise carved from necessity. The next morning, wagons set out, barrels empty, wheels groaning, drivers tense. The air was already hot, the horizon wavering with heat. I walked to the edge of town and watched them disappear into dust. Their return, full or empty, would decide the rhythm of the days to come. Hours later, the blacksmith's boy brought a small bucket to the boarding house, offering a dipper of water to each boarder. His hands were steady, his face solemn, as though he carried not water, but sacrament. When the dipper reached me, I drank slowly, each swallow deliberate. It was warm, faint with the taste of wood from the barrel, yet I savoured it as though it were the finest wine. That night, I dreamed of rivers, wide and rushing, green banks bending with willow, the sound of water strong and endless. I dreamed of rain striking rooftops, of barrels brimming, of children laughing as they splashed in puddles. And when I woke, my lips were dry, my throat parched, the dream fading into the stillness of another hot morning. Days stretched on. The wagons returned with barrels half filled, enough to ease but not to satisfy. The town endured, each sip measured, each cup shared carefully. No one spoke of abundance. No one spoke of waste. To speak of such things here was folly. And I learned, slowly, that water was more than survival. It was a mirror of trust. A man who offered his dipper to another proved himself worthy of respect. A neighbour who hoarded brought not safety, but suspicion. Water carried the weight of morality, of community, as heavy as any scripture or law. One evening, I saw the boy again at the creek. His jug slipped from his hand, tumbling into the shallow current, drifting toward me. I caught it, lifting it from the water, and carried it back to him. His eyes widened, cautious but grateful. He nodded once sharply, then turned without a word, running back toward his family. It was a simple exchange, yet it felt as though a thread had been tied between us, thin, fragile, but real. That night, the wind rose again, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and heat. I sat awake, listening to the boards creak, the town sighing in its restless sleep. And I thought of the truth I had learned. In the West, a man's worth was measured not by his coin, nor by his words, but by how he shared what little water he held. Morning light spilled across the street, soft at first, then sharp as the sun rose higher. The town was stirring, each soul pulled into the rhythm of necessity. I had grown used to the cadence of hammers, the creak of wagons, the measured voices at the well. Yet today, I noticed something else. The steady presence of women, their hands never idle, their labour weaving quietly through every corner of the West. In the boarding house kitchen, I watched a woman mend a shirt by the window. Her needle flashed in and out of the cloth, the thread pulling tight, neat as a row of stitches in the earth. She hummed softly, not a song for joy, but a tune to keep her hands steady. Her child slept in a cradle at her feet, his small fist curled around nothing, his breath even. To anyone else, it might have seemed a simple moment of care. But I knew enough by now to see more. The shirt was patched in places where fabric had thinned from hard work, its sleeves frayed by reins and rope. Her sewing was not craft. It was survival. Later, I walked past a cabin on the edge of town. A woman stood outside, her skirt dusted with flour, her hands resting on the handle of a pump that groaned faintly as water rose. She paused, shading her eyes against the sun, watching the horizon with a stillness that spoke louder than words. Beside the doorframe leaned a shotgun, its barrel polished from use, its wood worn smooth by fingers that gripped it often. She noticed me, gave the smallest nod, then turned back to her work. It was there, in those small details, that I began to understand. The West demanded not just endurance, but a kind of duality. Women here sewed and mended, baked and tended, but they also stood watch, kept rifles ready, and knew the weight of steel as well as they knew the weight of a child in their arms. In the general store that afternoon, I saw the same truth again. A woman came in carrying eggs wrapped carefully in cloth. She traded them for flour and coffee, her eyes sharp as she measured each scoop, ensuring no ounce was withheld. She spoke little, but her presence filled the room with an authority that needed no voice. When she left, she balanced the sack of flour on her hip, her free hand steadying the child at her side. The eggs she had given up were gone, but her bargain had kept her family fed. At the saloon one evening, men played cards at their tables, their laughter rough but quieted by weariness. The door swung open, and a woman entered. She carried a basket on her arm, filled with rolls she had baked. Without words, she moved from table to table, offering them for coins. Most paid gladly, some offered thanks, a few only nodded. She accepted each response with equal grace. When a man muttered something low, sharp, her hand brushed the handle of a pistol hidden beneath her shawl, and his words ceased at once. Bread and steel, both were hers to carry. I began to notice more once I looked. A mother teaching her daughter to thread a needle, her son to load a rifle. A wife boiling laundry in a pot, her shotgun propped within reach. A grandmother patching blankets while telling stories of winters past, her hands moving as steady as if she had done so under siege. These were not contradictions, they were harmonies, woven of necessity and love. One evening, I sat with a family who'd invited me to supper. Their cabin was small, its walls chinked with clay, its roof patched with shingles cut by hand. On the table lay cornbread, beans, and a pot of coffee that smelled of smoke. The father spoke little, tired from his work. The children were restless, but hushed quickly with a glance. It was the mother who carried the meal, who kept the flow of conversation gentle, who laughed softly when her youngest spilled beans upon the floor. When the meal was done, she cleared the plates, then reached for the rifle above the door. She laid it across her lap as she rocked in her chair, her sewing basket at her side. Thread and steel rested together there, and in her calm hands, neither seemed out of place. The West, I realized, was not kept alive by the loudness of men, but by the quiet strength of women. They were the keepers of both needle and shotgun, the ones who stitched not only cloth, but the very fabric of community. They carried burdens without complaint, their silence speaking louder than boasts ever could. Later that night, as I walked back to the boarding house, I passed again the cabin at the edge of town. The woman stood in her doorway, rifle across her arms, watching the horizon where shadows gathered. Behind her, I could see the flicker of lamplight, the shapes of her children moving within. She was sentinel and caretaker, guard and mother, her figure framed against the darkness like a story told without words. When I reached my cot, I thought of her still. I thought of the hum of the woman sewing in the kitchen, of the nod from the woman at the pump, of the steady gaze of the woman in the store. Their strength was not loud, not celebrated with cheers or applause. It was woven into the rhythm of every day, as constant and necessary as water itself. And as I drifted into sleep, I realized that the West would not have endured without them. For every man who carried a revolver, there was a woman who kept a rifle close. For every shirt torn by labor, there was a woman who stitched it whole. And for every hungry night, there was a woman who turned flour into bread, even if it was coarse, even if it was meager. The sewing needle and the shotgun, two tools of equal weight, two symbols of survival. In their balance lay the quiet truth of the frontier. That strength was not only measured by what could be fought for, but by what could be held together day after day, stitch by stitch, meal by meal, through silence and through storm. The week dragged forward, each day marked by dust, work, and silence. Yet even here, even in this raw edge of the world, Sunday came. It arrived not with bells ringing or choirs lifting their voices, but with the soft gathering of footsteps, the hush of people seeking a kind of stillness beyond survival. The chapel stood at the far end of town, leaning slightly against the wind, its whitewash faded to grey, its steeple bowed as though in humility to the vast sky. The door hung uneven, creaking when pulled, but inside it was clean, swept carefully, the wooden benches polished smooth by years of hands and bodies. A small window caught the morning light, throwing narrow beams across the floor, dust motes drifting like silent prayers. That morning, I joined the others as they filed in. The men wore their best coats, though most were patched at the elbows. Women carried children in their arms, smoothing hair and tugging at collars. Even the weary looked sharper here, their clothes pressed, their faces washed, their weariness hidden for the hour. Sunday was not about appearance, but about offering what little dignity the week had spared. The preacher was a thin man, his shoulders bent from years in the saddle, his Bible worn soft from handling. He stood at the front with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he carried. His voice, when it rose, was quiet but steady, filling the chapel not with grandeur, but with persistence. "We are dust," he said, his words lingering in the air. But dust is what the Lord breathed life into. The congregation nodded, some bowing their heads, some staring out the window where the sky stretched endless and indifferent. His sermon was not polished, not practiced for beauty. It was spoken as one man speaking to neighbours, his words plain, honest, shaped for ears tired of hardship. He did not promise ease. He did not paint visions of plenty. He spoke instead of endurance, of faith carried like a lantern through darkness. Children fidgeted on the benches, their small feet tapping against wood. A baby cried softly, soothed quickly by its mother's hand. An old woman coughed, her sound echoing briefly, then fading into silence again. Yet through it all, the preacher spoke, his voice the only rhythm holding the room. A hymn followed, led not by organ or choir, but by the trembling voice of a woman in the front row. Others joined, their voices uncertain at first, then stronger, weaving together like threads pulled from many frayed fabrics. The sound was not beautiful in the way choirs in the East might have been, but it was beautiful in its honesty, rough, uneven, yet full of hope. I sang softly, though my voice felt small against the weight of the song. As the notes rose, I felt something shift within me. It was not joy exactly, nor relief. It was something quieter, the reminder that no matter how far the frontier stretched, no matter how heavy the silence, people still sought to lift their voices together. Even here, where storms and drought ruled more often than kindness, they still believed in something greater than themselves. When the hymn ended, silence filled the room again. The preacher bowed his head. The people followed. And for a moment, the chapel seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the wind itself to bow in reverence. After the service, people lingered outside. The air was warmer now, the sun climbing, its light falling on faces that seemed softer than they had the day before. Conversations rose, gentle, almost hesitant. Neighbours asked after children, after crops, after sickness. Small loaves of bread were exchanged, jars of preserved fruit passed from hand to hand. In the shadow of the chapel, Sharing came easier. Words flowed freer. I stood at the edge, watching as a man helped an elderly woman down the steps, his hand steadying hers. A young boy carried a pail of water from the well, offering it to those who looked faint in the heat. A woman unwrapped a cloth bundle, revealing biscuits she had baked, passing them to children who gathered eagerly. Sunday, I realized, was not only about faith. It was about reminding one another that they were not alone, that the land might be harsh, but together they could soften its edges, if only for a few hours. As the day stretched on, the town carried that stillness with it. The saloon remained closed until evening, its doors shut, its windows dark. The blacksmith's hammer was silent, his forge cold. Even the animals seemed calmer, their movements slower, as though they too sensed the shift. The West paused, if only briefly, as though acknowledging that life could not be toil alone. That night I sat on the porch once more, listening to the wind. It carried no hoofbeats, no whispers of fear, only the faint echo of the hymn still lingering in memory. The stars shone above, cold and eternal, but they felt less distant, less severe. For in the chapel, in the voices raised together, I had felt a small warmth that reached beyond the dust and silence. And I knew then, Sunday came, even here. Not because the land allowed it, but because the people demanded it. They carved it out of hardship, held it against the emptiness, protected it as fiercely as they protected water, bread, or fire. For in the Wild West, faith was not ornament, it was survival. A seed planted in barren ground, watered by hope, kept alive by the stubborn will to believe in tomorrow. The morning after Sunday's stillness, the town woke again to work. The blacksmith's hammer rang out, wagons rattled down the street, and the faint smell of wood smoke curled into the air. But alongside the rhythm of daily labour, I noticed something softer. Laughter. Faint, fleeting, but present. It carried from the edge of town, light as a bird's call, rising above the heavier sounds of men and tools. I followed it and found the boy. He stood barefoot near the corral, no older than 10, his trousers patched, his shirt hanging loose. His hair was the colour of dust, his face streaked with the same. Yet his eyes were bright, sharp as glass, watching the animal before him with a patience that seemed far older than his years. Inside the corral paced a colt, young, wild, its coat the colour of storm clouds, its mane ragged, its movements restless. It tossed its head, snorted, stamped at the ground, the tension in its body spilling into the air. Its eyes rolled white at every sound, its muscles tight, coiled as though even the fence might not hold it. The boy said nothing. He simply watched, his hands resting on the fence rail, his body still. His silence spoke to the animal in a way words could not. I stepped closer, my boots crunching against gravel, and the colt jerked, ears flicking toward me. The boy shot me a glance, quick, sharp, not unkind, but warning enough. I stopped, leaning instead against a post a few feet away. "Yours?" I asked softly. He shook his head. "Nobody's." The colt snorted again, pawing at the ground. "Where'd it come from?" The boy shrugged, eyes never leaving the horse. "Drifted in last week. Been hanging round since. Won't let no one near." There was pride in his voice, though he tried to hide it. Pride that the animal lingered, that it hadn't vanished back into the endless plains. "Does it have a name?" I asked. The boy glanced at me, then back at the colt. His silence was answer enough. I watched as the horse circled, restless. Its movements were jagged, untrusting, Yet beneath its fear, there was strength, a wildness that spoke of survival, of hunger, of the endless distances it must have crossed to arrive here. It was, in its way, the very image of the West itself, beautiful, harsh, untamed, unwilling to be mastered easily. The boy lifted one hand, slow, deliberate. The colt froze, ears flicking, nostrils flaring. For a moment, it seemed ready to bolt, but then it stilled, muscles trembling, eyes locked on the boy. His hand hung in the air, steady, patient, waiting. At last, the colt snorted and turned its head away, refusing the gesture. The boy lowered his hand again, calm, unshaken. "He'll come round," the boy said quietly. I nodded. "Takes time." "Don't have much else," the boy replied, his voice carrying a weight too heavy for someone so young. I stayed with him a while, watching. The sun rose higher, heat spilling across the corral. The horse circled, slowed, circled again. The boy never moved, never pushed, only watched, breathing slow, patient as stone. At length, the colt approached the fence, not close enough to touch, but nearer than before. Its ears twitched, its nostrils flared, and its breath came fast. The boy leaned forward slightly, lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Only silence, shared between child and animal, heavy with meaning. When the horse turned away again, the boy smiled faintly. Not triumph, not victory, just the quiet recognition of progress. As days passed, I saw them often. The boy at the fence, the colt circling, always wary, always restless, yet never leaving. Each day, the distance between them shortened, if only by inches. Each day, trust grew, though slowly, fragile as a thread. No one else in town seemed to notice, or perhaps they chose not to. The men were busy with cattle, with wagons, with trade. The women with bread, with water, with mending. The boy and his horse were their own world, small and overlooked. Yet to me, they carried a weight as great as any sermon or barter. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, I saw the boy slip into the corral. His movements were slow, careful, his body turned slightly to the side, as if to seem less threatening. The colt froze, head high, eyes wide. For a long moment, neither moved. The air itself seemed to hold still, waiting. Then, slowly, the boy extended his hand. The horse shuddered, took a step back, then forward again. Inches closed, breath mingled. At last, its nose brushed his palm, light, brief, but real. The boy's face lit with a joy so pure, so unguarded, it seemed to break the hardness of the West itself. The colt pulled back quickly, snorting, stamping, but the boy did not chase. He only lowered his hand again, patient as before. The connection had been made. A bridge had formed. That night, I could not sleep. I thought of the boy, nameless in this story, and the horse, broken yet unclaimed. Together they seemed to mirror the West itself, harsh, untamed, but filled with a stubborn will to endure. Their silence spoke louder than words. In the days that followed, I wondered often about the boy's past. No one spoke of him, at least not to me. Perhaps he was an orphan, left behind by those who could not stay. Perhaps he belonged to no one but himself, just as the horse belonged to no man. In that, they were kindred. Two souls adrift, seeking tether. I began to see him less at the corral, though I knew he was there. The horse grew calmer, its circles slower, its eyes less wild. The boy's patience had begun to mend something deeper than reins could ever bind. And I thought then of all the stories the West would hold, of men and women, of dust and hunger, of survival measured in bread, in bullets, in water. Yet here, in the silence between a boy and a colt, was another story, quieter but no less true. A story of trust, of endurance, of hope, stitched slowly into a land that offered so little of it. As the days folded into weeks, I carried that image with me. A nameless boy, barefoot in the dust, hand outstretched toward a horse that the world had called broken. And in their fragile bond, I saw a lesson the West had been whispering all along. Sometimes survival was not about force, nor even about silence. Sometimes it was about patience, about waiting, about believing that even the wildest heart might, with time, draw near. The boy and the colt lingered in my mind for days, their fragile bond a reminder that even here, in a land that ground men to dust, tenderness still found a way. Yet the West did not allow long moments of stillness. Curiosity tugged at me, a restless thread, pulling me beyond the narrow borders of the town and out toward the open land. One evening, just as the sun began to sink, I walked the trail leading away from the main street. The earth was dry beneath my boots, baked hard by weeks without rain. Grass bent low, brittle, rattling faintly in the wind. Behind me, the town was already quieting, smoke curling from chimneys, shutters drawn against the coming night. Ahead of me stretched the horizon, vast and endless, where shadows lengthened and the world seemed to widen into something more than human eyes were meant to hold. The sky turned gold, then rose, then deepened into violet. Stars pierced the dark one by one, sharp and cold. The air grew cooler, though it carried the dry taste of dust. I walked until the sound of the town faded, until the only rhythm left was my own footsteps and the whisper of the wind. And then I saw it, a faint flicker in the distance, low against the ground. Firelight. It wavered, small but steady, its glow painting the air orange against the dark. I paused, heart tightening. Firelight in the open could mean many things. A family camped on their way west, a ranch hand tending cattle, or something darker. Out here, every light in the night carried weight. To show a flame was to reveal your presence. To hide it was to disappear into shadow. I approached slowly, keeping to the edge of the trail. The closer I came, the clearer the shapes grew. A small camp, no more than a blanket laid near the fire, a pot suspended on a thin iron rod, the faint scent of beans and smoke drifting through the air. Beside the fire sat a man, his hat tilted low, his body leaning slightly forward as though in thought. His rifle lay across his knees, casual but ready, the firelight glinting faintly off the steel. He noticed me before I spoke. His head lifted, eyes sharp beneath the brim. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. Only the fire spoke, crackling softly, sending sparks into the air. "Evening," I said at last, my voice low, careful. He nodded, slow. "Evening." His voice carried the roughness of the trail, low, worn, measured. He did not invite me closer, nor did he tell me to leave. The silence stretched, and in that space, a kind of decision was made. I would stay only if I earned it. I stepped nearer, moving into the fire's glow. Its warmth pressed against my skin, its light flickering across my boots. I stopped a respectful distance away. "Long trail?" I asked. He studied me a moment, then gave the faintest nod. "Long enough." The pot bubbled faintly over the flame. He reached forward, stirring it with the back of a spoon, then leaned back again. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing lines carved deep, eyes shadowed by years of dust and hunger. He looked neither hostile nor friendly, simply cautious, as all men out here learn to be. After a while, he spoke again. "You from the town?" I nodded. "Boarding house." He grunted, as though that explained enough. His gaze shifted back to the flames. We sat in silence, the fire between us. Its crackle filled the air, its smoke rose in thin threads into the night. Beyond its circle of light, the land stretched black and endless. Coyotes yipped faintly in the distance, their calls carrying thin on the wind. The horses tethered nearby stamped their hooves, restless but calm. He poured beans into a tin cup, setting it on the ground near me without a word. I accepted it, nodding thanks. The beans were hot, smoky, plain, but in the cool night air they tasted better than any feast. Each bite felt like sustenance, not only of body, but of trust. The smallest gesture of sharing, yet weighty in a land where strangers met with more suspicion than kindness. We did not speak much, but it was not an unfriendly silence. The firelight filled the gaps, carrying warmth that words could not. From time to time, he shifted, tossing another stick onto the flame, sending sparks flying upward. Each spark rose, then vanished, swallowed by the dark sky. "Travel alone?" I asked softly. He nodded once. "Safer that way." I thought of the town, of faces lined with suspicion, of the riders who had thundered in and left again, their silence heavy with threat. Alone carried danger, yes, but so did trusting the wrong company. We ate in quiet, listening to the night. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through dry grass, the coyotes sang their thin chorus. Above, the stars stretched cold and endless. At last he rose, stretching his shoulders, and walked a short distance from the fire. He scanned the horizon, slow and deliberate, then returned, seating himself again. "Best keep watch," he muttered. "Fire draws more than warmth." I nodded, understanding. Out here, fire was comfort, but also signal. It promised safety, but it also revealed your place to whatever eyes might be watching. As the hours passed, the fire sank lower, its glow shrinking to embers. I lay back against the ground, the earth cool beneath me, the sky sharp above. The man remained seated, his rifle still across his knees, his gaze never straying far from the shadows beyond the light. Sleep came slowly, heavy, wrapped in the rhythm of the fire and the faint sounds of the night. My last thought before drifting was of the truth the fire had revealed. In the West, even the smallest flame was a fragile thing. It carried warmth, yes, but it also carried risk. It marked you as living, enduring, human, in a land that often preferred silence. And as my eyes closed, I understood why men here guarded their fires as carefully as they guarded their words. Both could save you. Both could betray you. Both had to be tended with patience, with care, with watchful eyes on the trail's edge. When dawn came, the fire was gone. Only a scatter of grey ash remained, still warm beneath a crust of dust, faint threads of smoke curling upward before vanishing into the morning breeze. The man with whom I had shared beans and silence was already gone too, his bedroll folded, his horse's tracks fading eastward. Only the smell lingered. The faint, earthy sweetness of wood turned to ash, clinging to my clothes, to my hair, to the air itself. Fire burned bright, but its memory was always ash. I walked back toward town with that thought pressing on me. Each step stirred dust, carrying with it faint echoes of all that had burned before. Campfires, yes, but also cabins, barns, fields left blackened after storms of flame swept across the dry land. Fire here was never only warmth, it was risk, it was destruction, it was proof of how easily life could be reduced to smoke on the horizon. That day, the wind shifted, carrying a sharper scent into town. Smoke, fresh, thick, riding on the breeze. People turned their heads as they worked, eyes narrowing, breaths held. The smell was unmistakable, heavy with oil and pine resin, stronger than any cook fire or forge. Somewhere nearby, something larger burned. I walked with others to the edge of the settlement, where the land rolled gently downward towards scattered ranches. There, a column of dark smoke rose, staining the sky. Black against blue, it twisted upward, a signal no one wished to see. The ranch house was already gone by the time we reached it. Its roof had collapsed, its walls sagging inward, the timbers charred black. The air shimmered with heat, the ground littered with embers that hissed and cracked as the wind stirred them. A few men stood in a line, throwing buckets of water onto what little remained, though the effort was more ritual than rescue. The fire had already claimed its prize. A woman knelt in the dust nearby, her hands over her face, shoulders trembling. Beside her stood two children, their eyes wide and empty, staring at what had once been their home. A man, perhaps her husband, stood with his hands on his hips, his face hollow, smoke streaking across his cheeks like war paint. None of them spoke. What words could there be when everything they had built, stitched and guarded, now lay in smouldering ruin? The blacksmith arrived with tools, helping to pull aside what beams could be moved. Others formed a line, passing buckets, stamping out sparks before the wind carried them further. No one commanded, no one questioned. They simply moved, each gesture steady, each face set against despair. The West had no room for spectacle in the face of loss. I bent to help, my hands stinging as I lifted hot boards, my throat raw from smoke. The air carried the acrid tang of resin, the sweetness of burned wood, the bitterness of scorched earth. Ash clung to my skin, my clothes, until I felt as though I too had been marked by the fire. When the flames were gone, when only smoke and ruin remained, the people gathered around the family. They did not offer speeches. Instead, they offered what they had: bread, blankets, a corner of a cabin. One man placed a saddle at the husband's feet, muttering, "Horse'll carry what's left." Another woman pressed a jar of beans into the mother's hands, her eyes wet, but her face steady. A child tugged gently at the hem of the little girl's dress, offering half a biscuit. Ashes had taken much, but community gave back what it could. In the Wild West, mourning was not loud. It was quiet, steady, made of gestures that replaced what words could not. I returned to the boarding house that night, with smoke still clinging to me. In my cot, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind filled with images. The woman's shoulders shaking, the man's hollow gaze, the children's wide eyes. But more than that, I remembered the smell, the deep, clinging scent of smoke, the way it lingered long after the flames had died. Days later, the family had moved into the edge of town. They slept on cots given by neighbours, their meals simple but shared. The husband began working with the blacksmith, his hands blackened with soot once more, though now from iron rather than charred timber. The wife sewed for others, her stitches steady, her face quieter than before. Their children played faintly in the dust, their laughter short, almost uncertain. Life did not pause for grief. It folded it into the rhythm of survival. Ash was swept aside, smoke faded, and still the work of living continued. Yet the smell remained. Walking through the street, it seemed to linger in every corner, faint but persistent, as though reminding us all how fragile our cabins, our barns, our very breath truly were. The West carried its scars not in monuments, but in the air, in the way smoke clung long after the flames had gone. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I saw the husband saddle a horse, the same saddle gifted to him in the ashes of his loss. He mounted slowly, his shoulders still heavy, but his back straight. He rode out toward the horizon, smoke from another's cook fire rising faintly in the distance. The smell caught in the air again, and I realized how inseparable fire and smoke were from this land, how each man carried them as memory, as warning, as burden. That night I dreamed of riding through fields blackened by flame. Ash rose in clouds around me, stinging my throat, filling my lungs. Smoke trailed behind me, clinging to my saddle, my clothes, my skin. When I woke, the taste lingered, bitter and heavy, as though the dream itself had left residue. And I knew then, in the Wild West, fire was never only fire. It was hunger and hope, survival and ruin, warmth and loss. Its memory was ash in the wind, its shadow smoke on the saddle, and even when the flames were gone, it rode with you still, a reminder of how quickly the land could take back everything it had given. The first sign was not snow nor ice, but silence. One morning I stepped out onto the boarding house porch and felt it in the air, a stillness heavier than dust, sharper than heat. The sky was pale, washed thin, and the wind that had once carried grit now carried a bite. It was not yet winter, but the land had begun to prepare for it, and in the west, that preparation was as much warning as it was promise. The days shortened quickly. The sun, once relentless, seemed tired, slipping lower into the sky each evening. Shadows stretched longer, curling through the streets before supper was even finished. Nights came early, and with them, a cold that crept into walls, into bones, into breath. At first, the townsfolk bore it with ease. Coats were pulled tighter, fires burned hotter, boots were patched with extra leather. But as the weeks turned, the cold grew sharper, burrowing deeper, unrelenting. Water in buckets froze by dawn. Breath rose in white clouds, visible even indoors. Boards creaked louder, brittle in the frost. I learned then that the West had many ways of humbling a man. Drought starved him, fire threatened him, riders tested him. But winter stripped him down to the bone, reminding him of how small he truly was. The boarding house stove burned nearly day and night, fueled by wood stacked high in the yard. The landlady, a thin woman with a strength that seemed carved from stone, kept the fire fed, her hands black with soot. The heat reached only so far, leaving the corners of the rooms cold, the cots stiff with frost. Still, the fire was salvation, and each boarder took turns splitting logs to keep it alive. Outside, men worked slower, their hands stiff in gloves, their breath sharp. The blacksmith's forge burned brighter, its warmth spilling into the street, drawing neighbours close under the pretense of needing nails or tools. Children bundled in coats too large for them, their laughter muffled, short-lived in the biting air. Women sewed blankets from whatever scraps of cloth remained, their needles moving quick, their faces set with quiet determination. Yet no blanket, no fire, no coat could stop the cold from seeping in at night. In my cot, I lay curled beneath 2 quilts, my body trembling as the wind slipped through the cracks. Sleep came in shivers, broken often by the sound of the boards groaning, the timbers creaking as though the very house complained against the frost. One morning, I woke to find the window panes etched with frost, delicate as lace, hard as stone. I touched it lightly, and the cold bit my skin. The world beyond the glass was pale, muted, covered in a thin dusting of snow. The first of the season. It did not fall soft. It fell steady, purposeful, covering tracks, blanketing fences, silencing the earth. The town slowed further. Wagons groaned through the snow, their wheels slipping in ruts. The well froze, its buckets lowered into darkness that yielded only ice. Water had to be broken free with axes, its surface shattered like glass before it could be hauled up. Men muttered prayers as they swung, each strike not only against the ice but against hunger, against thirst, against despair. In the chapel, the preacher's voice grew softer, more solemn. "The Lord gives us seasons," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "Each one to teach us what we forget. Summer teaches toil, spring teaches hope, autumn teaches patience, but winter teaches us to pray." And I understood. The cold forced humility. It stripped away pride, left only the simplest needs: warmth, water, bread. It drove men and women alike to whisper prayers into their quilts, into their cups of coffee, into the air that turned those words to frost before they were even finished. One evening, I walked through the town as dusk settled. Smoke rose from every chimney, thick and white, hanging low in the air. The streets were nearly empty, save for a boy hurrying home with firewood strapped across his back. His breath came in sharp clouds, his steps uneven, yet he pushed on, his figure small against the endless snow. I paused near the chapel, where candlelight flickered through the window. Inside, a few gathered, their heads bowed, their hands clasped. Their voices rose faintly, carrying hymns cracked by cold, but steady in faith. The sound drifted out into the night, mingling with the wind, with the snow, with the silence of the land. It felt fragile, yet stronger than the frost itself. Back at the boarding house, the stove glowed red, its warmth a mercy. The landlady set a pot of stew on top, its scent filling the room. Beans, onions, a scrap of salted pork. We ate slowly, each spoonful warming throat and chest, each bite a reminder of how precious hot food was in the heart of winter. That night, as I lay beneath my quilts, I whispered a prayer of my own. Not loud, not formal, only a plea for warmth, for endurance, for another dawn. I was not a man of deep faith, yet the cold had taught me what pride could not: to ask for help, even if only from the silence beyond the walls. And when dawn came, pale and cold, I opened my eyes with gratitude. The frost still clung to the window, the boards still groaned, the wind still bit. But the stove burned, the stew simmered, the town endured. The cold had not broken us yet. And in that endurance I felt the faintest warmth, deeper than fire, quieter than prayer, yet real. The kind of warmth that could only be born in hardship, in silence, in the long, unyielding winter that taught us not just to live, but to pray. The cold deepened. Each morning, frost lay thick upon the ground, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Wagons moved slower, hooves stumbled on ice, and every breath rose white, fading into the sky like a ghost. Winter was a patient thief. It did not take all at once, but little by little, stealing strength, warmth, and at times, life. It was no surprise when the bell tolled. The chapel bell rarely rang, and when it did, the sound seemed to travel farther than any voice. It cut through the still air, low and solemn, each note hanging like a weight upon the chest. People emerged from cabins and houses, their faces pale, their steps slow, drawn by the sound as though compelled by duty rather than choice. A man had died. I did not know him well. An older ranch hand who had worked the outskirts of town, quiet and steady, his presence more seen than heard. He had fallen ill, some said, the cold settling deep into his chest until he could not rise again. Others whispered that it was simply the way of the West, a body worn thin by years of labour, given at last to the season's relentless grip. The burial was set for morning, when the ground was hardest. Men gathered with shovels, their breaths rising in steady clouds as they struck at the frozen earth. Each blow rang like iron on stone, each shovelful small, hard won. The ground resisted, unwilling to give up space, yet the men worked with patience, with persistence, carving slowly into the earth until at last the grave was ready. The body lay in a simple wooden box, built quickly from rough boards. There was no polish, no ornament, only wood hammered together, lined with a blanket that had once warmed him. Death here was not ceremony, but necessity. The box was lowered on ropes, creaking softly as it descended into the hollow ground. Around the grave, the town stood in silence. Women pulled shawls close. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Men held hats in their hands. No one wept loudly. Grief here was quiet, carried in stillness, in the set of a jaw, in the downward cast of eyes. The cold left little room for spectacle. The preacher stepped forward, his voice thin in the frigid air. From dust we are made, and to dust we return, yet the Lord remembers each soul, even here, even now. His words were not grand, not polished, but they carried weight. The people bowed their heads, listening, their breath rising together like a single prayer. Then, a song. It began with one voice, cracked and trembling, then another joined, and another. Soon the sound swelled, not loud, but steady, a hymn carried on cold air. The notes rose, uncertain yet faithful, wrapping around the moment like a quilt stitched from many hands. Children's voices mixed with the weary tones of their parents, their song less about melody than about unity. I sang too, my voice rough, unfamiliar with the tune, yet drawn into its warmth. The hymn spoke of light after darkness, of morning after night, of the promise that no winter lasted forever. The words faltered at times, but the meaning did not. When the song ended, silence returned. The ropes were pulled, the box lowered fully into the earth. Shovels scraped as men began to fill the grave, the sound harsh, final. Dirt struck wood with dull thuds, each one a reminder of endings. Yet even as the ground closed, the sun broke the horizon, casting pale gold across the snow. The light caught in the frost, turning the air into 1,000 tiny sparks. Children noticed first, their eyes lifting, their hands tugging at their mother's sleeves. The adults looked too, their faces softening as the light touched them. It was still cold, still harsh, still winter. But in that moment, the sun felt like promise. When the grave was filled, when the ground was smoothed, the people lingered. Some placed small tokens upon the mound, a hat, a strip of cloth, a sprig of pine. Others simply stood in silence, their eyes far away. At last, they drifted back toward town, their steps slow, their breath still visible in the morning air. I remained a while longer, the frost crunching beneath my boots. The mound stood plain and unmarked, save for the tokens left by those who had cared. Snow began to fall lightly, covering the ground in a thin white veil, softening the rawness of the earth. The sound was gentle, a hush that seemed almost like mercy. As I turned to leave, I thought of the song, of the way voices had risen together despite the cold, despite the silence. Death here was not new, not rare, but each time it came, The people resisted not with loud lament, but with quiet unity, with graves dug, hymns sung, and the steady endurance of those left behind. That night, back in my narrow cot, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind. The image of the grave returned to me, the rough box, the hymn, the snow. Yet more than sorrow, I felt the warmth of that sunrise, the way its light had touched every face, turning grief into something softer. And I understood then that in the West, life was never secure, never certain. But the second sunrise always came. It rose over graves as it rose over fields, over sorrow as it rose over joy. It was the land's quiet promise, its only mercy, no matter how long the night, the sun would rise again. The day after the burial, the town seemed quieter than usual, though the sounds of work still echoed. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of wagons, the barking of a dog somewhere near the edge of town. Life, however heavy, pressed forward. Yet as I walked the street that afternoon, I saw two figures who seemed to carry the entire story of the West between them, one in his years, the other in her youth. The old man came first. He shuffled slowly, his back bent, his boots worn thin, his hat frayed at the brim. His beard was white, his eyes clouded but still sharp enough to search the horizon, as though expecting it to change at any moment. In his hand, he carried a folded piece of parchment, edges curled, creased from countless openings and closings. A map. I had seen him before, always near the saloon or the general store, speaking little, spending less. He was a man who seemed made of distance, every wrinkle a trail, every line of his face a journey endured. People called him the Tracer, though I never learned his true name. They said he had wandered these lands longer than most had lived, that he carried routes and rivers in his memory like scripture. His map was not drawn to impress. It was worn, hand-sketched, more memory than measure. Yet he held it as though it contained more than directions. The second figure was a girl, no more than 12, perhaps 13. She stood at the far end of the street, her rifle propped against her shoulder, its stock taller than she was from hip to crown. Her hair was plaited, her skirt patched, her boots dusty. Yet her stance was steady, her gaze firm. She did not play as children might elsewhere. She stood guard. I learned her father had gone north with cattle weeks earlier, leaving her and her mother to tend the cabin at the edge of town. The rifle, too large for her frame, had been left as protection, and she carried it not with fear, but with a sense of duty that seemed far too heavy for her years. It was late afternoon when their paths crossed. The old man shuffled to the edge of town, where the girl stood near the well, her rifle still in hand. He paused, leaning on his cane, his map tucked beneath his arm. Their eyes met, the clouded gaze of age and the sharp, unblinking stare of youth. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, slowly, the old man unfolded the map, its parchment trembling slightly in his hands. He studied it, his brow furrowed, then turned it toward her. "You see this line?" he asked, his voice cracked but steady. She stepped closer, tilting her head. The map showed a river, winding and faint, drawn in uneven ink. "That's where water runs," he said. "Not always, not in every season. But when the snows melt, it fills. Enough to drink, enough to keep cattle alive. Long way from here, though." The girl studied the map with surprising focus. Her small finger traced the line, her lips pressed tight. She said nothing, but her silence carried the weight of thought. The old man folded the map again, tucking it carefully into his coat. "A rifle's good," he said softly. "But knowing where the water lies, that's what'll keep you standing." The girl glanced down at the rifle, then back at him. At last she spoke, her voice clear, steady, stronger than I expected. "Then I'll need both." The old man chuckled, a low rattling sound, but his eyes softened. "Aye," he said. "Both." They stood together a moment longer, two figures bound not by blood nor by time, but by the quiet truth of survival. Age had given him memory. Youth had given her vigilance. Between them lay the story of the West itself. Maps and rifles, knowledge and endurance, past and future. As the sun lowered, casting gold across the town, the old man turned to leave. His steps were slow but sure, each one guided by years of walking this land. The girl remained where she stood, rifle against her shoulder, her gaze on the horizon. Neither had spoken much, yet their exchange lingered, heavier than words. That evening, as I sat on the porch of the boarding house, I thought of them again. The tracer with his map of fading ink, the girl with her rifle too large for her hands. One carried the weight of where he had been, the other carried the weight of where she must go. Both were bound to the land, and both knew its unforgiving truth. Survival here demanded not one strength, but many. The stars rose sharp above, and I imagined the old man walking beneath them, his map tucked close, the lines of rivers and trails etched not only on paper, but in his very memory. I imagined the girl in her cabin, the rifle beside her bed, her sleep light, her dreams edged with the knowledge that dawn might demand more of her than any child should give. And I realized then that the West was not built only by men with guns or women with needles, but by the meeting of generations, by the maps drawn in trembling hands, and by the rifles carried by those too young to know rest. Both were fragile, both were strong, both were the Wild West. The days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months. The land did not change quickly. It shifted slowly, like the turning of a great wheel, grinding on no matter the wishes of the people who lived upon it. Some mornings brought sunlight sharp as glass, others brought skies heavy with grey. Some days felt endless, others slipped by like whispers, but always the dust remained. Dust on boots, dust in hair, dust caught in the seams of coats and the corners of rooms. Dust that clung to letters, to quilts, to the surface of water pulled from the well. It was more than dirt. It was the mark of the West itself, the constant reminder that here, nothing stayed clean, nothing stayed untouched. The land made its presence known in every breath, in every swallow, in every weary step. I came to see the dust not only as burden, but as witness. It had seen the stagecoaches come and go, the riders thunder through, the fires rise and fall, the graves dug and filled. It had drifted between the sewing needle and the shotgun, settled upon the hymn books, gathered in the lines of the old man's map. Dust told the story of all that had happened, and all that would remain long after we were gone. Life in town endured, though never easily. Water was fetched, bread was baked, fires were tended. The blacksmith's hammer still rang, though slower in the cold. The saloon's doors still swung, though its laughter was measured, wary. The chapel still filled on Sundays, voices rising like frail but determined wings. The boy with the colt still lingered at the corral, hand outstretched, waiting with patience that seemed endless. The girl still kept her rifle close, her eyes steady, her duty heavier than her years. And always, the silence remained. Not the silence of absence, but of presence. The silence that carried whispers on the wind, that spoke in glances, that warned, that comforted. I had learned its language now. I no longer sought to fill it with words. I listened, and in listening, I understood. There were moments of hardship still, nights when the cold bit deep, days when the well yielded little, evenings when hoofbeats in the distance stirred hearts into dread. But there were also moments of grace, a loaf of bread shared across a table, a hymn sung low but steady, a sunrise spilling light across frost, promising another day. I began to see that survival here was not measured in victories or triumphs. It was measured in persistence, in the small, quiet acts of endurance that carried one day into the next, the lifting of a bucket, the stitching of a tear, the steadying of a child's hand. These were the threads that held the West together, fragile but strong. One evening, I walked again beyond the edge of town, following the trail until the lights behind me dimmed. The horizon stretched vast and unbroken, the sky wide with stars. The air was cool, the dust rising soft beneath my boots. I stopped and listened. No hoofbeats, no voices, only the wind, steady, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from cabins far behind me. I thought then of all I had seen, the bread, the bullets, the barter, the letters carried by the wind, the silence that spoke louder than words, the riders who came and went, their thunder leaving fear in their wake, the water pulled from wells, guarded as gold, the sewing needle flashing, the shotgun leaning against the door frame, the chapel hymns, the boy and his colt, the old man and his map, the girl with her rifle, and the graves, each one covered in frost, each one marked not with stone, but with memory. The West was not easy, nor was it kind. It was dust and silence, fire and cold, hunger and thirst. It was loneliness carried like weight, and yet it was also persistence. It was voices raised in song despite the frost. It was firelight shared despite the risk. It was children laughing, even briefly, even in the dust. It was sunrise, always sunrise, no matter how long the night. As I turned back toward the town, I felt the truth settle in me as steady as the dust itself. Few would last long here. Many would break beneath the weight of hunger, cold, or silence. Yet some would endure, not through force, not through pride, but through patience, through kindness, through the quiet, stubborn will to remain. And those who remained carried the West within them. They stitched it into cloth, folded it into bread, drew it on maps, taught it to children, sang it in hymns. They became part of the dust, part of the silence, part of the story that would drift long after their names were forgotten. That night I lay upon my cot, the boards creaking softly beneath me. The wind whispered through the cracks, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and the endless breath of the land. I closed my eyes, listening, and felt a peace deeper than I had known before. For I understood now that the Wild West was not only hardship, it was also resilience, it was also hope. It was also the quiet truth that even in dust, even in silence, even in the coldest night, life remained. And as sleep took me, I wished the same for all who listened, that the dust would settle gently, that the silence would carry comfort, and that every sunrise would bring with it the promise of peace.